Hey friends, I'm going to talk today about a passage in Exodus 16. Now, that may not be one of those things that you hear people talk about a lot, but it's a very important story in the Old Testament. And here's kind of what it's about. So without reading the whole chapter, the idea is that God provided supernaturally for the people of Israel. They're on the backside of seeing God do amazing miracles to liberate them from slavery in Egypt. And they're not quite yet in the land of promise that he was going to lead them to, but in this liminal space, this space between these amazing things of liberation from slavery and entry into the promised land, they had this kind of tricky situation where they're kind of out in the middle of the wilderness and they started wondering what they're going to eat. And if you know the story, you know that God provided supernaturally for them. He provided this substance called manna. And it's really funny because the Hebrew word for manna literally means, what is it? and it describes it as being this kind of like white wafer thin, almost like a grain kind of a thing. But then God also provided for them quail, meat in the desert. Like a wind blows and brings quail for them to be able to eat so that they can satisfy their stomachs. And if you know the story, you know that over time, even that didn't really seem to satisfy. There were still the same old issues, right? People would try to pick up more than what God had told them. They would try to gather multiple days worth of manna, and God told them to only gather one day, and then it would mold, and then it would smell bad, and then they'd have to go back and remind everybody about everything. And there was complaining, and there was all these different things, and yet God was supernaturally providing for them. It's a beautiful story. And I do think that it's fascinating that one of the things that happens is when they move across the River Jordan into the new land, there's a very specific place where it says, and the manna stopped. God did something different. He took care of them in the desert, but he didn't promise to just keep doing that forever. In fact, I think it's fascinating if you actually look at this passage and you realize God was teaching them to depend on him day by day, every day. Every day. The manna was only supposed to last for one day. They would have to depend on God the next day. They'd have to leave their tent and hope and pray that God had been faithful to provide manna for the next day. Every day was a new adventure, and every day was a new place to trust God. And doesn't this sound kind of remarkably similar to what Jesus talked about prayer in Matthew 5? If you want to flip all the way ahead of there, there's a famous passage where Jesus actually teaches his disciples to pray. And you'll notice one of the things that he says is in this is how you should pray kind of section is, give us this day 10 months worth of food and resources so that we don't have to depend on God. That's not what it says, is it? It says, give us today our daily bread. It harkens back to this idea that God is often asking us to trust him for day by day. There's nothing wrong with being a good steward of financial resources, of saving, of planning, of making sure that we are anticipating costs and doing things well with our finances, with our lives, with the stewardship of our time, our talents, and our resources. But when we begin to trust in those things as our points of security, as our points of safety, that's when things go wrong. I think it's a very telling thing that even here in Exodus 16, in the midst of God's miraculous provision, there was still the temptation to just kind of maybe help God out a little bit and stockpile for ourselves the things that we needed so that we maybe just didn't have to trust so much that God would deliver the next day. I think God is always asking us, inviting us to trust him for our daily bread, our daily manna, trusting him day by day. And one of the beautiful things about that is if we will live in such a way where we are willing to trust him with that kind of tangible faith, and he can lead us anywhere, brothers and sisters. He can lead us through a Red Sea that he parted, where we get a chance to walk on dry ground. He can lead us out of slavery. He can lead us into a promised land. He can lead us through the grave to resurrection and life. And again, while it's not wrong to save and plan and anticipate, I think that kind of simple, childlike, day-by-day faith puts us in a position where we are confident of who God is, and he can lead us anywhere he wants to go. So I just encourage you today to be the kind of people who are grateful to God for the manna that he provides. Trust in him that he will continue to do and that he will continue to provide all that is necessary to follow him wherever he calls you to go. Don't stockpile, trust, or hoard in your resources to be your source of safety and security. and follow him wherever he leads you to go next.